Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hustle AI. Today, I have with me an old friend of mine, Altaf. Altaf and I, we go like long time back. He was my boss. He was also my client. It was a little bit of an intertwined relationship. And like this story is about like 10 years old, right? We were still, working on some products. So recently we just happened to connect over some different topics. And like, of course, so, one of the leading things that popped up was our work in AI. I have been doing some work with AI and applying it to how we could build products using my startup at MicroGigs. But at the same time, Altaf has also been like doing a lot more things with AI. He has been conducting training workshops, and even like where Altaf works at HSBC, he's been like kind of like leading some of their AI initiatives. So I thought, okay, maybe we should record this conversation. Maybe make this something useful for other industry leaders and figure out how they could think about using AI as they are making certain important decisions in their businesses or in their companies. Okay, so our topic today is how could business leaders use AI in enterprises. And one of the things that we want to do today is keep the conversation bit simple. And based on this, we may have more more of similar episodes in future. But today, if you look, AI keeps hovering between two streams. On one end, we have the very generic stuff, ChatGPT and OpenAI, what it does. And on the other end, you see a lot of like complicated topics like llama fine tuning and how do you get procure the chips to train your models and whatnot. But we today we want to address this something somewhere linked between and figure out or rather help the senior leadership people in the senior leadership how they could use AI or think about using this in different in the companies that they work on. So without wasting time, maybe Altaf, like we could just start with and your introduction. Like you could just give your background, what you do, and talk about your like latest interests and pursuits in the realm of AI.
Sure. Thanks, Jitin. So I've spent almost 2 decades now in technology. I come from an engineering background, and I spent most of my career working for financial services, running my own startups, doing some angel investment. I think generative AI is one of the most exciting things which has happened in the last year or so. And I think a number of factors have led to sort of this turn that we have seen in AI. Machine learning was used in large enterprises before as well. But I think with transformers released in 2017, the scene has been slowly changing. And clearly, with the advent of ChatGPT, there's a lot of excitement around how AI can create new content. And what this really means is for enterprises, they're all considering improving productivity of their workforce and also doing automation within enterprises. So that's the exciting space, productivity and automation. That's what most of the enterprises must be and should be thinking about.
Cool. Okay. So I think, Altaf, you have also been helping HSBC where you're working right now and making some important decisions and how they look at the transformation with AI and whatnot. So maybe you could just give a high level of like how should industry leaders think about this. Now you are based in Hong Kong, but like the stories would be similar. Say for business leaders or executives in Northern America, like how should they be approaching AI? As in should they be building their own models or should they be how much should be investing in figuring out like how they should be approaching this versus buying and among other things.
Right. I think one should take a pragmatic approach. There is some amount of hype around generative AI, I must admit, and there is some amount of usefulness which can be used in a practical enterprise setting. So I think business leaders should think about business use cases. They should think about what makes sense, what problem are they trying to solve. So in general, the advice is yes, one, they should be educating the business on what generative AI is and what is the potential of this technology. They should also be evaluating vendors that they work with and look at problems or solutions which those vendors would provide, which would eventually become a commodity service. And then beyond that, they should think of their specific use cases which use their data and see how they can create a competitive advantage for themselves. I think a lot of the productivity gains that we see eventually will be built by the big vendors like Microsoft, Google, AWS. Most of the enterprises work with one of these partners. So a lot of AI based services will be available as a commodity or as a cloud service with one of these vendors, which means a large number of enterprises are going to get that from their cloud vendor. So what's left then is your own proprietary data and what you do with that. I think that's where you can create the competitive advantage. So yeah, I would say for leaders, enterprise leaders, it's like a three-step strategy. Start educating the business on what generative AI is, and alleviate any fears that the business may have. Because I also see that in general people are also afraid that this might impact their jobs, etc. So I think you're going to alleviate those fears. The way I see it is, you're going to make people understand that this is just going to help improve their productivity, right? If the workforce improves its productivity, I think it can do more. So one is the education aspect. Two is what problems are you going to solve with generative AI? I think you need like a every enterprise leader should start thinking about the use cases. They should also justify, right, why solving this with generative AI makes more sense, either from a scale perspective, cost perspective, or from a return on investment perspective. And the third aspect I would say is just prepare for the services which are coming in through the vendors versus models, proprietary models or foundational models they can use on their own data to solve their own specific problems, either to improve customer experiences, create new products and services, or even create new business models.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. So, like one of the challenges for most businesses, like most enterprise companies, and this I know from the examples over here in Toronto. Like there are some of my friends who work in large enterprises. Even Chat GPT, they do not have the permission to use Chat GPT. Which is the tool which almost everyone is using. And their fears are, maybe it is valid. They are afraid that they don't want their data, or rather open AI to train on their data, and indirectly the other or competitor banks or whatever, they get an added advantage out of it, right? So how do they navigate this situation?
So I think specifically in terms of OpenAI, so Microsoft has partnered with OpenAI, and a lot of enterprise customers of Microsoft are getting private instances of the GPT models or the family of GPT models through OpenAI, Microsoft provided Azure instances. So if you're a Microsoft customer, if you're an enterprise, and if you're a Microsoft customer, you get access to a private instance of the GPT model through Azure. And when I say private instance, which means it's a copy of the model. It's not the public model that you and I use, right? So usually you would have enterprise managed cloud in which the enterprise would have access to their own private GPT, either a GPT-3 or a GPT 3.5 or even 4, right? And Microsoft makes these private instances available to their enterprise customers for a negotiated sort of fee. Again, it's token-based pricing. And that way, you can think about the keys to access that particular private model just stays with the enterprise. So not even Microsoft, not even OpenAI can access that model. And some of these enterprise contracts, the data which is sent to this model remains private to the organization, as well as it's not used for training. So enterprises can also look at providers outside of OpenAI. OpenAI is not the only player in town. I think there are players like Cohere who specialize in on-premise enterprise deployments. And then there are other players who make these private instances available. So not everything goes to a public model. Enterprises would always take a very cautious approach in terms of where they expose their data, because there are lots of, especially in financial services, there are lots of regulations around what can you do with internal data or customer data, and enterprises would be very cautious about exposing this data to public models. So yeah, in
Interesting.
summary, using private models, using private instances of the models from the available providers. After, of course, comparing the models, but I would say OpenAI is still leading the pack with their Microsoft partnership.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So I believe, okay, it's then like for them to have these conversations, right? Making like rather informing their, uh, the business leaders or their top execs that there are options, like there are ways to navigate the worries around data security. If that is one of the major concerns, like you might get a private instance where you might still be able to take advantage and make sure your workforce is, step ahead of your competitors or the, the general, the populace, at the same time not be worried about data, right? Okay, and I think like this is good to know. Okay, although just want to like switch gears a little bit. I know that like you do training workshops, you have like few deals, with some of the premium like educational like companies where tie-ups and partnerships where you like offer training. So maybe you could just talk a high level about that, and then we will drill deep a little bit, because one of the things you do is you offer training, right? Like for execs, for people who are looking to get their hands dirty with AI, LLM models, so diffusion models, and so on. So there's one topic which I found very interesting, which is the generative AI for executives. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. But before that, maybe you could just tell your background on, or rather your own interest in education, and like where all these partnerships are headed to. And just so that like for the audience, in the past actually Altaf built a startup which like did rather which built training, or rather sorry, educational apps for kids, right? Like Tiny Tabs, which is a very popular app around like some time back. Yeah, so education and training has been Altaf's passion. Now like this, there is this intersection with AI, so we are like seeing something more interesting here. I will let Altaf speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, I think I've been passionate about both technology and education for some time. I think for the past decade or so, and I think the kids space, as you said, right in the past, the kids space, kids education space is really a green field because no matter AI or no AI, I mean every kid growing up has to learn language, has to learn alphabets, has to learn characters, music, poetry, etc. So that's a really exciting space. I think I've done a lot of work in that space. We spent over 2 or 3 years creating all these apps, creating a digital solution for kids. I think I'm passionate about education. I think that's one of the things that everyone needs, and sort of aspiring parents always want their kids to become smarter. And I think beginning young is really the right thing to do. Um, so bringing that, I think carrying on with that passion when I joined back, when I started working back in Hong Kong 5 years back, I got the opportunity to sort of lead the curriculum for a training boot camp. So I spent almost a year, one trying to develop a hybrid product for learning, and at the same time, looking at the data science curriculum. That's where we picked up. That's where I picked up a lot of machine learning, deep learning. I taught deep learning, and I also happened to create sort of a lot of projects. We created a lot of practical projects for the training boot camp, and there are a lot of interesting ideas that the participants put in, or the people who took the boot camps. They did a lot of interesting projects. I think that's where the journey started, and that's where the potential of AI could be visibly seen and felt. All right, carrying on with the advent of ChatGPT, as soon as I got hands-on access to it, I ended up writing a book in 10 hours. And I really wanted to see what value could ChatGPT, what could it do with this, right? So yes, it had a very nice interface. It was the first time that a large language model was available to the public. So what could you do with something like this? And I tried sort of writing a reference book, tried creating some value. That book is called Techscape. I'll be happy to share the link with the audience. It's a free ebook now. It's available to everyone. And yeah, that's how the interest in AI and trying to combine education and AI together. So at the moment, I spend a lot of time. I do spend considerable time looking at what's happening in the industry, and also sort of educating people who want to learn, right? Who want to find out more about this tech, and they're interested in applying this tech. And Jitin, as you mentioned earlier, right? I mean, I see three categories of people, right? I see one is the engineering side of things, where people are training models and are learning to train and fine tune these models. Then I see another category of people who are into the operational side of things, doing LLM ops, for example. And there's a whole bunch of infrastructure related companies bringing the size of the models down, or trying to get the inference cost down. So there's a whole family of companies doing LLM ops, and above that there's a whole application space which is wide open, because even today you don't know if you have seen some idea which is lurking out there and some practical usage of large language models. I think it's still out there, still not discovered yet. So I think I'm more on the application side, and in my training that I do to anyone who's available to learn is always forcing people to think, right? How do you apply this thing in your own area of business? What are the best ways in which you can apply this? And that really forces them to think what this technology can do, what generative AI can do, and it really marries the learning with the practical usage. So I'm a big believer in applying some of these things to your own personal and business benefits.
Interesting. Yeah. And like about your partnerships, I mean, like, with some of the training institutes, do you want to just like,
Yeah,
expand on
sure.
that
So
a bit?
that's done outside of work. That's typically, I know we have a couple of training companies here in Hong Kong, and
Mhm.
we have simply tied up with them, saying, "Look, I can deliver the course, I can deliver the learning." These are professional training companies. They already have a sales and
Right.
marketing arm. They already have an audience. So if they can find an audience, then I can come in and deliver the course. So it's done sort of side of the desk after work. Professionals who want to learn on a weekday, maybe spend 2 hours, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and then come and learn this over a month or two. That's the kind of partnership. It's a small time partnership that we have started with. So let's see. I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Yeah, okay, pretty cool. Yeah, so now let's drill down a little bit deeper into this. Like, you're offering like, this training course here. So one of the topics that caught my eye was generative AI for executives.
Okay.
So maybe you could just, talk a little bit more on this, as in like, high level, what they should be expecting out of this, like, maybe like what the benefits that they could get out of this, right? And of course, this is just, we are just laying the groundwork. If people are interested in discovering more about this, then they could directly reach out to you, and you could have this, you could maybe explain to them, like, how they could proceed or get more details around this course, right? So at least like for our audience at a high level, if you could just talk a little bit on that.
Right. I think generative AI for executives is an exciting course. I mean, it tries to educate the executives, give them the intuition of what really these generative models are and what their capabilities are. So, in terms of large language models, we cover some of the intuition behind large language models in terms of what are transformers and how do they really operate under the hoods. There's a little bit of intuition there. Also, in terms of the image models, the audio models, and all the other models coming up, right? So we try to give a little bit of intuition and also the understanding that how these models work behind the hoods. From there, we also force them to think via some small exercises that how they could use this in their own area of business, and then we facilitate a session where business leaders can come up with a plan, uh, maybe quarter by quarter, create a plan as to how they could gradually bring this into the enterprise. And finally, we also talk about data privacy. We talk about biases. We talk about risks, and we talk about some sort of a plan to mitigate some of these things which come with sort of generative models. So how do they? So it essentially guides them to think in the right direction for some of these issues, some of these important factors. Then we cover a little bit of how do we overcome challenges and problems with language models in particular, right? So in terms of the hallucination problem, or in terms of ensuring that the data they produce is actually factual, and the importance of human in the loop. What kind of tasks can be completely delegated to the language model or the generative AI versus what cannot be, and what would always need humans in the loop? So it's a
Okay,
little bit of education, a little bit of a few exercises. It opens up their eyes to the intuition, so they can put these things together and they can take pragmatic decisions in the enterprise.
cool. Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And maybe I'm just wondering, like, if you could just take this opportunity and just talk a little bit more on this. The one problem you already hinted, but there are these two major problems with AI, right? One is, how do you make sure that data is factual? Like, because it's just a training model, it's just generating data based on how it has been trained on. Uh, at least at this stage, there is no easy option for it to verify, right? So, as an industry person who's advocating AI into enterprises, what are their options? I mean, of course, the easiest is you could just add a human in the loop, right? But again, I don't know how much cost that would add, and what the what would be the differential versus using AI versus having more people there, right? So that is one, and B is the general worry, like I guess in general, I guess like with AI, people are a bit worried on risk. You already mentioned something about the data security aspect of it. There are models at which they have the option, but maybe we could just expand on that a little bit, which I guess is like the two of the major roadblocks, right? Which is forcing people to take us wait and watch approach.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting one. I mean, these models are known to sort of hallucinate to begin with, and they don't necessarily provide factual information because they're all they are is basically a probability machine on words which occur one after the other, right? So I think it's early stage in the industry. People are trying to solve this problem, especially the open source community. So one of the things that you could do is instruct the model to use what we call as RAG, retrieval augmented generation, which means it uses less of what it knows and what it has been trained on, and it uses more of the context that is provided by you, right? So which also means that storing your own internal content in these databases, vector databases, and retrieving some of the answers from that database and providing the model the context from which it can generate a response. So one is this context or retrieval augmented generation, in which you provide the context and the model responds from the context. And you provide the instructions to the model to do specifically that. And using most of the models have these parameters which you can control, the hyperparameters. When you invoke the model, you can sort of reduce down or bring down its a setting. One of the settings is temperature, and that's an indication of how much creativity can the model use. So if you bring that down absolutely to zero, you are instructing the model not to use its own creativity and to use the context which has been provided and only provide the answer from that context. Now, this is one strategy that has been used and that sort of brings you closer to the ground truth. But then you could add a layer on top of that where you could cross check the output coming from the model, right? So there are now these model evaluators, right? So just like there are parsers, you could actually force the model to give you output in a certain format. You can also now force the model to evaluate its response, and you could have another model or you could have another software agent looking at the output of the model and then sort of verifying it. So it adds to your layer, but then it also sort of allows you to correct anything non-factual which is coming out. So these are some of the
Interesting.
techniques. It's still early days, and I'm sure
Yeah.
progress will be made in this particular area.
Interesting. Okay, I guess this is very interesting, and to be honest, even I'm also like learning a lot. I mean, like as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, that we have been using AI to build some parts of microgigs, which is my startup, right? And yeah, like definitely, this is also how do we measure the how much factual the content is. I guess this is something that we could loop in. This is very interesting. But like okay, like on the same topic, in terms of all this, right? Of course, the one option is we all wait till the models mature. But let's say if some company wants to get ahead of the curve, right? What are their options? As in, like do they have to spend a lot of money in training custom models? Because what you mentioned right now, how do we make sure these LLM models they could read a certain context, and then we having other agents which could verify the content which is within that certain context and all? Does the existing tools allow us to do this, or do we have to kind of like create custom models, fine tune it, figure out all this? How do you get all this, the nvidia chip servers, and nvidia this 800 chips which are generally used for this training? It is the prices are going through the roof. How would a company like manage these situations?
Yeah, I think companies should stick to their core businesses. Definitely
Mhm.
think about how to leverage these. Think of these models as tools, right? Another tool that you got in your arsenal to solve problems,
Mhm.
to improve productivity, and create automation, right? So you should always think about your core business and what value are you delivering, and how do you enhance the value with the advent of generative AI, right? Um, I think they should take a step by step approach. Um, I think the context generation or RAG, retrieval augmented generation, is not an expensive thing to do, right? It's essentially getting your data, ingesting your data into these vector databases. And now the traditional databases like Postgres also have some of these features now built into the database itself. Or you could look at a specialized vector database like a ChromaDB or a Pinecone or a Quadrant. There are lots of them sprouting around. So if you can adopt one of these, and I'm sure even Microsoft will have partnerships with one of the vector database companies, or maybe they might come up with their own vector database. So depending on which vendor you have partnered with, AWS, GCP, or Microsoft, enterprises should look at available choices for vector databases. Make sure that they create a private instance, have access to a private instance of a vector database, and then start ingesting some data which they could use as knowledge base. So typically every company, either a startup or an enterprise, has knowledge base either for customer service or for product or service based knowledge base, right? So for example, if you're running micro gigs, I'm sure people have questions about micro
Mhm.
gigs, and then you would want to provide automated answers, right?
Yeah.
Just take your user manual and ingest into a vector database, and then use a retrieval algorithm to do a semantic search, take your results out, and just use your LLM to formulate the responses back to the customers, right? So that's a very common use of where we are. That's the most common use how enterprises are currently using LLMs. But as I mentioned before, it will go beyond this eventually. So you'll have
Yeah.
more interesting use cases as enterprise start getting the confidence in these LLMs, create private instances, and then really marry these with other models, right? So you don't need to just have one model. You could have a family of models working
Yeah.
together. And that's where the next space of agents come in, which is interesting. And maybe we can have a separate discussion on
Of
agents.
course.
So you can mix and match models, and you could have a orchestration layer which decides which models to use to solve what particular problem. So I think, yeah, the future is pretty exciting. So yeah, to summarize, enterprises should take a pragmatic approach. They should look at their internal knowledge base and how they can ingest that using retrieval augmented generation. They should reduce the hallucination problem by providing specific instructions using only the context provided in the documents. And they should also prepare for the future. They should prepare the use cases because a lot of progress is made in this field. If some of these technologies mature quite fast, what would the enterprises do, right? So they have to be prepared for some of the use cases which can either help them scale or help them provide new services and business models for their customers.
Of course. Cool. Okay, that is pretty cool. Like I guess like yeah, we will maybe like within few minutes to just wrap up this session and then figure out like a next session because this is a topic which doesn't stop, right? There are so many things that we could keep talking on. But I just want to kind of like understand a little bit more. Let's say if any of our listeners, if they were to take some value out of this, and maybe even if let's say they were to reach out to you, get more information on the course, and even if they were to like pursue that, what could be the few examples that they could push through their enterprises, right? Like now it could be for them like I don't know, it could be customer support is something that I could think of, but is there something on engineering
Yeah.
related, operations related, legal related? Like what would be the some of the use cases where let's say they could talk to their business leaders or the execs, hey, this is what we should start thinking about.
Yeah. So as I said, right, customer service seems to be the most obvious one. But let's say if you don't want to do something which is facing the customers on day one, right? Then you could have an internal knowledge base. Even if there's a company with 50 or 100 employees, they have so many of these internal documents and policies. It could be legal contracts, it could be agreements, it could be HR related services, right? How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I book vacation? What is the vacation policy? There's a whole bunch of things on the HR side, on the legal side. Uh, if you move on to large enterprises, then there's just a lot more, right? This is
Hmm.
multiplied 10x or 20x, right?
True.
How do you get so most of these knowledge currently is on internal web servers on the intranet. So think
Hmm.
about this: if you could take all of that and just ingest it into a simple database, which then just does a semantic search, and uses your LLM to provide answers. Uh, there is an option that you may. One of the challenges there is, the information keeps updating, right? So how do you keep everything updated? You could just ingest everything every night, or you could just ingest the delta every so often, right? Every week or every night, you could run a batch job and just ingest all the deltas. And then you could just potentially get rid of all the servers. You don't need the servers which run the intranet. So that's
Interesting.
one way of thinking about it. Internalizing all the knowledge that the enterprise has into a semantic search and a vector database combination. Then two, you got to think about the tools that you use, right? So everyday tools, like all of us use Office, for example, in one way or the other, right? We use Word, Excel. Now these tools are going to get supercharged with the generative AI paradigm. You could, for example, with the advent of Copilot in Office 365, you could potentially drop a bunch of documents on SharePoint, and then you could start asking questions about them in the future, in the very near future, right? So as soon as Copilot and Microsoft is releasing Copilot in the next quarter,
Mhm.
think about it, right? You just store your documents in SharePoint and you start asking questions on it, or you start referring those documents to create other content. So
Right.
this is coming. This is just around the corner. So that can sort of lead into another area of productivity. But then everybody using Office 365 and these features are going to get that, right? So again, it's
Yeah.
going to become very common. So where you got to plan ahead is using your own data, right? What can you do with your own data and what problems can you solve? I think now is the time for leaders, especially, to think and sort of create those use cases, evaluate those use cases, look at the ROI for those use cases, and get it prioritized so that in the next quarter or so, when all these vendors come up with these commoditized services, they are in a good position to apply some of this within the enterprise.
Interesting. Okay, that's pretty cool. And let's say, if anyone whoever is interested in your courses, is there any minimum qualification? Do they need to have some technical background to understand more, or even if they're from business background, can they hop onto your courses?
Yeah, so
How
there
is
are
that structured?
AI for executives and AI for everyone. They are generic courses. We prefer people having slight sort of tech savviness, but I think nowadays everybody is tech savvy. If you use a smartphone, you're already tech savvy.
Cool.
You're already using language models on your smartphone sometimes without even knowing.
Yeah.
So I think if you use a smartphone, if you're curious, then you can take AI for everyone or AI for executives, and that's sort of more generic. Even though you may see some code, I think it's pretty basic and it's pretty intuitive. And then there are courses for people who are more on the engineering side and they want to do things and they already know a little bit of either JavaScript or Python. Then we have a couple of other courses. Again, this is all sort of in the evening after work. You just want to gradually learn these things. You want to get your hands dirty. You got to start thinking about how to apply this in your workplace. So I think it's a fantastic channel and opportunity for people to do that.
Awesome. Okay, that is pretty good. Yeah, I guess Altaf. I guess with that we could maybe wrap up this session. We'll figure out like whether we need another episode, because there are so many different topics we could deep dive. Right, even this RAG, this RAG, retrieval augmented generation. I would like to learn more on that. Yeah, so maybe like we could figure out what our next topic could be, and we'll decide on the frequency.
Okay, thank you
Any
for having me.
closing thoughts? Yeah, no worries. Any closing thoughts?
No, it's really an exciting space, and it's a space which we are early. I think we are early in the first year or so of generative AI. So I think there's more to come. The industry is moving really fast. A lot of people are excited, both in the enterprise space and also in the startup space. The open source community is quite active. So I think we have something groundbreaking here. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I'm trying to learn as much as I can, and I'm also willing to share as much as I've learned with others. Thank you for
Very
having me
cool.
on the
Okay.
podcast.
No problem. Okay. Thank you, Altaf. I guess that's a wrap. You will have the coordinates to contact Altaf in the description below. I will let Altaf share more details, but how you could reach out to him directly, and the details of his courses that he's